Welcome to this lecture organised by the International Association for the Study of Arabia. I'm Noel Breheny, Chairman of the Association. This lecture is given by Quentin Morton on the history of Qatar, based on his recent book, Masters of the Pearl, A History of Qatar. He's written 9 other books, several dealing with aspects of the history of the Gulf. In this lecture, he will illustrate the forces that have shaped Qatar and other Gulf states and show how much the region has and is changing as a result of economic and social development and the wealth garnered from oil and gas. Over to you, Quentin.
Thank you. Thank you, Noel, and thank you to the Association for inviting me to speak about my new book, Masters of the Pearl, History of Qatar. So I just start by explaining about my name. I write under the name of Michael Quentin Morton, although I'm known as Quentin. When I started writing, I decided to use my full name because it incorporated the name Michael, which was my father's name. And he was an exploration geologist, and he roamed the Middle East between 1945 and 71 in search of oil. And at one stage, we came to Qatar and stayed for several years at the oil camp at Dukhan, hence my connection with Qatar. It was often said that Qatar had no history before the coming of oil, but I'd known better than that from quite an early age, because I recall going into the desert with my father and walking along a wadi and finding Stone Age artifacts, arrowheads and spearheads, which we collected and sent off to the museum. So when I had to finish my last book, I was thinking about my next project. I thought it would be quite a good idea to write about Qatar and its history, although apart from the arrowheads, I didn't know a lot about it. However, I was quite fortunate in 2018, early in 2018, on a visit to Doha to run into Dr. James Onley, a leading Gulf historian, and he told me a lot about the early history of Qatar and really opened my eyes to the fact that there was a great deal of history to be told in the formation and development of the Qatar we know today. So today I'm going to talk about my book. There's a lot of detail in the book, and of course it would be difficult to cover that detail in the time allowed, so I'm not going to get too immersed in the finer points. But what I hope to do is to draw out from the book the themes relating to the development of Qatar, and particularly its people and the ruling family, the Al Thani. So we'll do that, and then at the end of the talk I'll summarize and have a brief look at where Qatar is headed in the future. So I'll now go to my slides. So this is the cover of my new book, Masters of the Pearl, A History of Qatar. And we start the story with the movement of tribes from Central Arabia, Nejd, towards the coast. These movements were sporadic and took place over many years, involving different groups of Arabs moving from Nejd to the seaboard of the Arabian Gulf. This is important to our story because the ruling family of Qatar, the Al Thani, traced their ancestry to the Bani Tamim, who were a tribal confederation based around the town of Ushakia in Central Arabia, the Nejd being a high plateau of Arabia. And here we have a picture of Ushakia as it is today, restored, of course. And in about 1700, the Madid section of the Bani Tamim moved from Ushakia to Yabrin Oasis, and eventually, a few years later, ended up in and around Zubara on the northwestern coast of Qatar. And they settled down there. In the meantime, other tribes were moving, and one of the other tribes on the move, or families on the move, should I say, were the Al Khalifa. And they, first of all, came to Zubarah, left, went to Kuwait, and then came back to Zubarah in about 1760, 1762. So just to have a broad overview of developments over the next couple of centuries, we have Qatar at the center of things, and the ruling family, the Al Thani. The Al Thani didn't really establish themselves, become prominent, as far as we know, until about 1849, 1850, when Mohammed bin Thani, the head of the family, moved to Doha. But they were essentially a pearling family. They made their money from the pearl trade, owning pearling boats and gaining revenues from the pearl trade, which were then gathered into the family. Of course, as a result, the family became quite wealthy and prominent in their district, which was Fuareg to begin with, and then, as I say, they came down to Doha. The revenues that came to the Al Thani were obviously welcome, but also a cause of friction, because there were endless arguments which stretched over many, many decades into the 1950s over the division of money. And so pearls, whereas they were in one part a blessing, they were could also be a curse to the family unity. The other aspect was succession, which was a perennial problem with many of the Gulf ruling families. And we can see as time goes on how succession arguments, squabbles, battles even, mark the history of Qatar and the way that the royal family emerged into the family it is today. So we have Qatar, the Al Thani established in Doha in about 1850, Mohammed bin Thani as the leading sheikh of a group of sheikhs, pearling sheikhs, if you like, of Doha, and we could call those loosely as the Doha Confederation. But in my view, it's too early at this stage to identify Qatar, the peninsula of Qatar, as a nation. We have the Doha Confederation and other tribes arranged around the coast and up towards Zubarah, where essentially the Naim tribe resided, and at that time, and were held their allegiance to the ruling family of Bahrain, the Al Khalifa. The Al Khalifa left Zubarah and settled in Bahrain as the rulers, having defeated the Persians in 1783. And of course, the Al Khalifa are the ruling family of Bahrain today. So Bahrain gained its wealth again from pearls, lucrative pearling grounds around Bahrain. And another theme that runs through Bahrain's history and dealings with Qatar, of course, is territory, and particularly dispute over Zubarah, but even dispute over the whole peninsula, because as we'll see, Bahrain considered itself to be in control and rule over the whole peninsula, not just Zubarah. And this is a theme that runs through the history for up until modern times. So we have Bahrain. To the east is Abu Dhabi. Abu Dhabi, of course, is an emirate today, part of the United Arab Emirates, ruled by the Al Nahyan family. And again, their wealth was based on pearls, very lucrative pearling grounds to the east of Qatar. And this, of course, was a source of friction and conflict with Qatar and the Al Thanis as they vied over those pearling grounds. And territory, inevitably, the result of this rivalry was arguments over territory. And as we'll see later on, arguments over the inlet at Khor al Udaid, which is often referred to as an inland sea, popular with pirates hiding from British gunboats, but also the bone of contention between the Al Nahyan family and the Al Thanis. And thirdly, we have the Nej, ruled by the Al Saud family. Nej being where the Al Thanis originated from, and really coming into prominence in the 18th century with the arrival of the Wahhabis. The British referred to the Al Saud as the Wahhabis, although in fact the Wahhabis were the religious wing of the Al Saud's army. The Wahhabis on the Gulf Coast, and also they conquered Zubarah and Bahrain before being repulsed. Because of the tribal links between Nejd and Qatar, there has always been this very strong connection between the two ruling families, Al Saud and Al Thani. And certainly the Al Sauds, even up to the 1930s and 40s, considered Qatar to be theirs. So we have a situation, Bahrain considers Qatar to be theirs, Nejd consider Al Saud considered Bahrain, Qatar to be theirs, and Abu Dhabi is in conflict with Qatar over the pearling grounds to the east. Finally, to complete the picture, we have a rivalry, international rivalry between Great Britain and the Ottomans. The Ottomans arrive in Qatar in the form of flags, first of all, flags being positioned, 4 flags being positioned over buildings in and around Doha. And the Ottomans then sending troops in 1872 to occupy the fort. The initial reason for the Ottoman troops occupying the fort at Doha was to protect the town from Saudi raiders. There was a civil war going on within the Al Saud family, and at first the Qatari sheikhs welcomed the Ottoman troops, but that soon wore fairly thin, and they were soon chafing under the rule of the Ottomans. We'll deal in more detail about the Ottomans in a moment. So the ruling, or I should say the prominent member of the Al Thani family, Mohammed bin Thani, moves to Doha in about 1849. In 1851, the Al Saud occupy Doha. Mohammed manages to play off both sides, staying in Doha and then remaining when the Al Sauds retreat and Al Khalifa rule is restored. But there's still evidence of Al Khalifa influence and control in Doha when in 1863 William Palgrave, an English traveller, visited Doha, and he on one occasion travelled by donkey down to Wakra and met Mohammed bin Said, who was also an important pearling sheikh. And he was welcomed and they spent some enjoyable time together, and then Palgrave left. However, a few days later, Mohammed bin Said was arrested and taken to Bahrain in chains and held there, imprisoned for 8 years by Mohammed bin Khalifa, the head of the Al Khalifa family. So that just demonstrates the power that the Al Khalifa still held in 1863. Relations between the Doha sheikhs, Abu Dhabi and Bahrain deteriorated to the extent that in 1867, a joint Abu Dhabi and Bahraini fleet bombarded Doha, and the British a year later intervened with the political resident Pelly arriving at Doha and signing a treaty with the Doha sheikhs, Mohammed bin Thani signing on behalf of the Doha sheikhs. And as a result of that, it's claimed that Qatar then became independent of the Al Khalifa of Bahrain, although we'll look at that in a bit more detail shortly. And as I said earlier, in 1871, the Ottomans arrive and raise their flags over Doha, and the Ottomans stay until 1915, although it's a very checkered history. So we look again at the events of 1868. There's been a battle, a sea bombardment by Abu Dhabi and Bahraini fleet of Doha, resulting in great destruction. And the treaty which followed was signed between Great Britain and the Doha sheikhs recognized Mohammed bin Thani as the leading sheikh of the Doha Confederation. Now, a lot of historians claim as a result that was the creation, the unification, if you like, of the Qatari nation, and that the Qatari Peninsula became a whole nation at that point. It's not something I would agree with, because if you look at the document that was signed, you can see that it was signed by Mohammed bin Thani on behalf of the Doha sheikhs and the Doha tribes, and these being sections of tribes who resided in and around Doha. For example, the Al-Bukawa, one of their sheikhs signed, was one of the sheikhs who supported Mohammed bin Thani, and Mohammed bin Thani signed the treaty on their behalf. But the Al-Bukhari in the north were not party to the treaty, neither were the Naim, who were occupying Zubarah. And of course, nothing was heard about the Bedouins to the south, nomadic tribes, who were not represented at all by the treaty. So I think it's a fallacy to say at that stage Qatar was a united nation. And as we'll see later on, there are several instances which demonstrate that Qatar was quite divided between the Al Khalifa, tribes owing their allegiance to the Al Khalifa, and those owing allegiance to the Doha Confederation and Mohammed bin Thani. So the question is, did Mohammed bin Thani's treaty with Great Britain mark the formation of modern Qatar? And my answer to that would be no, but I understand there are differing views, and no doubt the arguments will go on. So have another look at pearls, because pearls are essential really to our understanding of the way that Qatar developed into modern times. Pearls, as I've said, were the mainstay of the economy. In fact, they were the sole source of income for Qataris for many centuries, with the result that everything revolved around pearls. Of course, it generated money and generated wealth, particularly for the prominent families and particularly for the ruling families of the Gulf. As I mentioned before, this was a source of good fortune, but also a source of conflict within families, and also a source of conflict outside families, as Bahrain and Abu Dhabi came into conflict with Qatar. This we can look at in a bit more detail, created what I would call a pearl merchant mindset, and that is pearl merchant mindset, the arts of attraction, engagement, and the spreading of power and influence through wealth. And this is very, I think this is very apparent, most apparent, in the dealings that the Qatari rulers had with their neighbours, and the way that they sought to not only to survive in quite a dangerous world where we have three other ruling families against them for a lot of the time, not only to survive, but also to seek protection. And this is the concept of duala, which is seeking the protection of a larger nation, a larger power, to seek, go under their umbrella, if you like. And this again comes out in Qatari politics quite often, and can be seen in a moment when we deal with Sheikh Yassin in his dealings with the Turks and the British, trying to find some leeway between them, but also seeking their protection when it was necessary. Certainly Mohammed bin Thani had a more favourable approach towards the British, whereas Yassin was less well disposed towards them. And other characteristic of a pearling economy is are these cycles of boom and bust, where we can see the markets one year would be prosperous, another year would not. with the results that the pearling fleet stayed at home, pearls weren't selling, money dried up, and great hardship was brought to Qatar and its people. And finally, moving ahead to the 20th century and taking a broad view, we can see a certain symmetry between pearls and oil, in the sense that pearls were a single resource economy for Qatar. Pearls went into decline with the Great Depression from 1929 and the onset of cultured pearls from Japan. That brought a decline in the pearling industry, and without pearls, I think Qatar would be in a very precarious position. However, around that time, about a decade after the start of the Great Depression, oil was discovered at Dukhan. And of course, then the oil comes on stream. And in modern terms, that is what Qatar was first came to prominence for, was for oil as an oil-rich nation. But we can see there that as the pearls declined, the oil rises up, the oil wealth rises up, and in a strange way, the oil money bolsters the structures, the tribal structures of Qatari society, in the sense that the oil money comes to the sheikhs, who, among other things, use the money to spread largesse and also use it for patronage, and therefore bolster their power, which of course they'd done in the pearling days. So in that sense, there's quite a similarity between pearling economy and the oil economy, petroleum economy, and also applies to obviously gas, hydrocarbons generally, so that we can say that these are both single resource economies, which was good for Qatar, but on the other hand had its drawbacks, as the decline of the pearling industry trade showed. That, you know, once it was in decline, what else was there? And I'm sure that's a thought that's been at the back of the mind of Qatari rulers ever since. We hear about the decline now of oil, that oil's days are numbered, and therefore it's important that these oil-rich countries diversify and seek other sources of wealth, which of course they have been doing for many years. So let's come now to perhaps the most prominent Qatari of the 19th century, and that is Yasin bin Mohammed. So Yasin, as the name suggests, is the son of Muhammad al-Thani, and he came to prominence as the ruler who really stood up to the Ottomans and who established himself across the peninsula. Yasin is a very interesting character to study. He was, you could say he was a warrior. He was a philanthropist. He was a religious leader. He was a poet, a man of many talents. But perhaps his greatest talent of all was to mobilize the tribes that he could, organize them, and use them to his own ends. So if we look at the chronology, in 1878, the Naim at Zubarah, they owe allegiance to the Al Khalifa. So they're going to be seen as a threat to the Doha Confederation, certainly. And so that a battle takes place, and Yasin triumphs and defeats the Naim. Over on the eastern side of the peninsula at Khor Al Udaid, there's another conflict going on with Abu Dhabi. And in 1888, Abu Dhabi forces raided Doha, and Yasin's son, Ali, his favorite son, was killed in the raid. Yasin was stricken with guilt, with grief, and as a result of that, he sent his forces into the Liwa oasis and carried out a bloody revenge. These events signified a great rivalry between the two leading the ruling families, the Al Thani and the Al Nahyan. We then move on to 1893, the Battle of Wajba. Here, Yasin scored a famous victory against the Ottoman forces. It didn't result in the Ottomans leaving Doha or Qatar, but it was a severe loss of face for them. And the reason for his victory is very much down to the fact that Yasin's forces had access to modern rifles, the Martini Henry rifles, which had been procured through the services of Yusuf bin Ibrahim, who was an Arab trader from Kuwait. And there's a very strong bond between Yasin and Yusuf bin Ibrahim, which we'll see plays out in various events, both in Qatar and in Kuwait. For example, in Kuwait, events at one stage with when Sheikh Mubarak killed his two brothers in Kuwait, Yasin was organizing an army to march on Kuwait from Qatar. It got as far as the border with, such as it was, with Nej, but then turned back when news came that the ruler of Jabal Shammah, Ibn Rashid, had died. And so Yasin didn't have any support and realized it was futile to go on. But that's an illustration of how events were taking place not only on a local level in Qatar, but were interconnected with the wider canvas of the Gulf. In 1895, we have a situation where the Al bin Ali tribe leave Bahrain after an argument with the Al Khalifa, come to northern Qatar and end up at Zubarah. Nasser bin Mubarak, who was a pretender to the Bahraini throne, then assembles an army and a fleet, army comprising mainly of the Bani Hajir, and with the backing of Yasin, who supplied ships from his fleet. This fleet gathers, and the clear intention, certainly to the British, is that the fleet is aiming to invade Bahrain, which of course the British can't accept because Bahrain is an important part of their imperial jigsaw puzzle. They need to have a presence in Kuwait and the support of the Al Khalifa in order to resist any Ottoman expansion in the area. So the British intervene, attack Yasin's fleet, capture 120 vessels, and eventually release some of them and destroy the others. And Yasin's ordered to pay a fine of 30,000 rupees. So Yasin returns to Doha to lick his wounds, and as he grows older, he starts to take a less active part in the affairs of the Doha and the surrounding area. And Doha is left in the hands of his brother Ahmad. One of Yasin's tactics was to retreat every so often, particularly when he was having arguments with the Ottomans, to leave them to it. And as a result, there would be disorder in and around Doha, with the result that the Ottomans were quite exposed and were reminded of the fact that they really relied on Yasin to keep the country in order. But anyway, Yasin had retreated to his desert encampment, and in 1905, when his brother was effectively in charge of Doha, unfortunately Ahmad was assassinated, and Yasin was brought back into the fray, and stayed in charge until 1913, when his son Abdullah, not his eldest son was Khalifa, and that in itself was a cause of conflict within the family. But Abdullah succeeded his father, and Yasin died in the same year. So if we just look again at these territorial disputes, Zubarah and the Hawa Islands, we can see them both there on the slide. Zubarah in the northwestern corner, and the Hawa Islands below them. The Hawa Islands came to particular prominence in the 1930s because they lay in the line of the Dukhan structure, because oil was being looked for in the area of Dukhan. Geologically, the Hawa Islands were in the same line of the Dukhan oil bearing structure as it was discovered in 1940, and therefore the future of the Hawa Islands became a matter of great concern to both the Al Thani and the Al Khalifa. And we find that the British were eventually asked to intervene, and made a determination in favour of Qatar for Zubarah, and in favour of, and that was in 1936, and in favour of Bahrain, in favour of, in respect to the Hawa Islands, in favour of Bahrain, and that decision was made in 1939. But as we'll see, that wasn't the end of the matter. And then if we move on to Khor Al Udeid on the other side of the peninsula, this is the place where pirates used to hide, and became a great cause of conflict between Qatar and Abu Dhabi. And after the troubles of the 1880s, there was still sort of skirmishing going on between the two sides, and it eventually took the intervention of the political resident Sir Percy Cox to settle matters in 1906, when he made a decision to award Khor Al Udeid to Abu Dhabi. So the overall picture in all of this is an ongoing rivalry between Britain and the Ottomans in the Gulf. British ruled from the sea. They didn't like to become involved in conflicts on the land, and as a result relied on their naval power. And the main British obsessions, if you like, were to stop arms smuggling in the Gulf and stop the slave trade. When the Ottomans came on the scene in 1871, raising their flags over Doha, the British at first accepted them and hoped that they would provide some assistance towards suppressing piracy in the Gulf, suppressing the arms trade, and also suppressing slavery, the slave trade. However, this didn't really prove to be the case. The Ottoman forces were essentially land-based, although they did have a navy, and depended in Qatar on their presence at the fort in Doha. And here we can see a picture of Ottoman soldiers on the march. The Ottoman soldiers suffered from very poor conditions for most of their time in Doha, and were fairly ineffective. They couldn't march more than 4 hours from Doha. They weren't allowed to, so their range was limited. So they spent most of the time confined to their fort. And various time visitors to Qatar came and saw the condition of the troops, and they could see that they were in a very poor state. So when the Battle of Wajba happened, although Yasin defeated the Ottomans on the ground, the Ottoman presence continued, and as did the British presence. But British attitudes were hardening. There was a disagreement within the British government between the India office, who wanted to resist the Ottomans at all costs, and the Foreign Office, who took a broader, wider view of the world and wanted to make compromises with the Ottomans, taking into account the whole of the Ottoman Empire, wherever it was in the Middle East, taking, as I say, a broader view. So the Ottomans and the British come to an accord in 1913, 1914, and they sign a treaty which effectively divides Arabia into spheres of influence. The only problem is that meanwhile on the ground, Ibn Saud and his army expelled the Turks from Al-Hassa, that's the eastern province of Saudi Arabia, and basically take control of the province, irrespective of what the treaty said. By the time it was signed, it was a fact that the territory was occupied by the Al Saud. And there was a fear, certainly amongst the British, that the Al Saud forces wouldn't stop there, that they were going to Qatar and take Qatar over itself. But that never happened. Of course, Sheikh Abdullah, who is now the ruler, was no doubt feeling nervous about the whole affair and was keen to enter into a treaty with the British. The result of that was the 1916 Anglo-Qatari Treaty, which gave Qatar a measure of protection, although the treaty was really aimed at maritime protection. There was provision about landward protection, but all it said was that Britain would provide its good offices should there be any threat from the land, which transpired wasn't actually guaranteed to protect them from attack on land. So Abdullah spent a couple of decades, rather nervous decades, I would think. He was on occasion summoned to Riyadh and had to pay homage to Ibn Saud, who was the ruler of the Al Saud at this time. But in 1939, matters came to a head when an oil concession was granted to Anglo-Persian, the forerunner of BP, and oil was, as I mentioned earlier, oil was struck in 1940. Even at this stage, Ibn Saud claimed that Dukhan, where the oil concession, where the oil prospects looked best, even he was claiming at that stage that Dukhan, the western side of Qatar, belonged to him. So you can see that was always a problem. In 1936, the British made their decision about Zubarah, and in 1937, Sheikh Abdullah took matters into his own hands, and his men attacked the Naim at Zubarah and effectively expelled them from Zubarah. In 1940, oil is struck. Meanwhile, the designated successor is Hamad, Sheikh Hamad, the eldest son of Abdullah. He's the crown prince, but unfortunately he dies before Abdullah, which creates a bit of a crisis. In 1949, Abdullah abdicates and appoints Ali, his second son, as the ruler. Unfortunately, when Abdullah departed, he took the treasury with him. And this was apparently a tradition amongst the Al Thani, which clearly caused difficulties for the incoming ruler. So the coming of oil, very briefly, oil is struck. The original oil field started drying up quite early. There were technical problems with it. They found oil further down, and then those technical problems were also solved, and so the oil came on stream. There are lots of stories about the workers who came from Doha in trucks, which they gave names to. This one is an international truck they call the Internash, and humorous stories, but also tragic ones. And there was also the offshore exploration, which again had a tragic side when one of the rigs sank offshore. Amongst these discoveries, in the 70s, we have the Great North Field being discovered. And of course, it wasn't only oil, it was gas. And this is where the future prosperity of Qatar lay. So just to look at the succession with Sheikh Ali. So Sheikh Ali is now appointed. Abdullah's departed with the money. Sheikh Ali now has a dilemma whether to appoint his son as his successor, his son being Ahmad, or to appoint Sheikh Hamad, his brother's son, Khalifa, as his successor. Sheikh Ali takes a few years to make an announcement, but in 1957, he comes good and appoints Sheikh Ahmed as his designated successor, the Crown Prince, which clearly doesn't please Khalifa, who claims that a promise had been made by Abdullah. But anyway, the rivalry between Ahmad and Khalifa goes on for many years and culminates, as we'll see, in 1973. Sheikh Ali abdicates like his father in 1960, and also like his father, he takes the treasury with him. We now move on to the 60s, a time where there are attempts to reform, but not very effective. And in 1969, the British, who are obviously the protectors of Qatar and a number of Gulf states, announces the decision that because of financial reasons, they're going to leave the Arabian Gulf. This causes some consternation amongst the Gulf sheikhs, with the result that they meet together a month later in Dubai, and the first signs look promising. It looks as though they will come together and form a union of 9 sheikdoms, that's Bahrain, Qatar, and 7 trucial states. However, as time goes on, it becomes clear that there are disagreements. And in August 1971, it's certainly clear to the British that Qatar and Bahrain will seek independence from the trucial states. And in September 1971, independence is declared. Now, unfortunately, Ahmad enjoyed going to Switzerland on regular visits, and this was a time when he was in Switzerland, and the documents were signed in Switzerland. There's a rather comical episode where they have to scrabble around for an official seal, a stamp, to stamp the documents with, and can't find one, and eventually a clerk appears with a very strange assortment of implements, eventually one of which is used to stamp the document with. So all the paperwork's done, but Ahmed, of course, is in Switzerland, and it falls on Khalifa to make the announcement to Qatar, which he does on television, though not many people had television. Word quickly spread, and there were celebrations in Doha, and certainly Khalifa's standing went up and Ahmed's no doubt went down. In December 1971, Britain withdrew from the Gulf, and the trucial states became the United Arab Emirates. So we now come on to the years of financial prosperity for Qatar and a great boom in construction. The early construction of mosques, for example, in Doha, also involved the destruction of buildings. This is a picture taken by Christine Osborne in 1975 of a building an old building being demolished in Wakra. The building boom sucks in foreign workers, which starts to become a problem, and is clearly reflected today in concerns about the kafala system and the proportion of foreign workers to Qataris. And of course, natural gas, the North Field, which is shared with Iran, was an extremely good source of income for the Qataris, and technical developments in liquefied natural gas meant that gas could now be transported anywhere in the world, much to Qatar's benefit. It wasn't all destruction, of course, to create new buildings. Some parts of Doha were renovated, and this is a picture of Souk Wafiq. And finally, we arrive at the shining city of Doha today. So as Qatar gets more wealthy, it's a small nation in a dangerous world. What does it do? Does it still keep its head down, or does it try and assert itself in the world? So we've heard of these tribal and territorial issues, and of course they're still going on, and particularly the Hawa Islands and Zubarah, although purportedly settled by the British, hasn't been, because both sides are still arguing over it as we progress through the 20th century. After Saudi Arabia attempted to mediate between the parties, that failed. it went to the International Court of Justice in The Hague, and a decision was made which really reflected the British decision. Zubawa was awarded to the Qataris, and the Harbour Islands went to the Bahrainis. And that was a decision made in 2001. Bahrainis recently, particularly during the blockade, have expressed unhappiness with that decision, and every so often say they're going to challenge it, but that's the position as it is at the moment. Kufus incident, this is an early indication of Qatar asserting itself in the Gulf. This is where it's said that some Bedouins came across the border from Saudi Arabia and killed two Qatar policemen at a border post. Khalifa was away, Sheikh Khalifa, who was ruling at the time, was away, and his son Hamad took control of the incident and stood up to the Saudis. Eventually, it all fizzled out after mediation from the Egyptians. But as I say, it was a clear indication, particularly of Hamad and what an assertive character he would become. Khalifa was, as I say, the ruler. There had been a coup. Ahmed had been deposed shortly after the independence. One other factor that affected Qatar's approach to Gulf affairs were the Gulf Wars and the realization that during the first Gulf War, 1990 to 91, when Saudi Arabia was invaded, that if the Qataris couldn't rely on the Saudis to protect them, they needed to look elsewhere for a protector, which they did. And they went to the Americans, and you'll find that when the next Gulf War came round and America invaded Iraq, the Americans had set up their air base at Udeid, Khor al-Udeid, which of course has a certain history to it. The Gulf Cooperation Council, this was an attempt by the Gulf countries to come together and discuss matters of mutual concern, and also to create a combined military force under the Peninsula Shield. In all of this, there's an ongoing theme of relations with Iran. Qatar needs to be on good terms with Iran. They're caught in the middle between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and also they've got this American air base, which no doubt offended Iran. But somehow Qatar managed this balancing act with Iran. But their relations with Iran are a cause of concern to their neighbours, particularly Bahrain and Saudi Arabia. In the wider Middle East, certain issues arise. Al Jazeera is a satellite TV and news channel set up by the Qatari government, which comes to prominence during the Arab Spring and is said to be the voice of revolution, saying unpopular things that are unpopular with the ruling families, but more popular with people involved in the Arab Spring uprisings, which seems a very strange stance for the Qatar ruling family to take, and one which puts them out of favour with the other ruling families in the Gulf. The Qatar's support of Hamas, the terrorist organisation on the Gaza Strip, which caused great concern from America, who saw the Qatar's attempts to provide money for Hamas for buildings, etc., freed up money for Hamas to spend on its own terrorist agenda. So brought the anger of the United States on Qatar, and also Qatar's support of the Muslim Brotherhood, which in 2012, under Morsi, ruled Egypt until Morsi was deposed in 2013. But in the middle of all this was Qatar's support of the Muslim Brotherhood, which caused great consternation amongst its neighbours, and also Qatar's involvement in proxy wars. So we have Qatar involved in Syria, Libya, and Yemen. Certainly in Syria and in Yemen, the results are disappointing, and it's been said that at this stage, Qatar finds itself out of depth. And then if we look at the even wider picture of Qatar in the world, of course, Qatar is well known now in the Western world, whereas before it was a remote country that few people knew about, apart from the fact that it had some oil. So Qatar's approach has been to go out into the world, to involve itself, to invest in projects, and perhaps the most symbolic project of all is the Shard, this immense tower in London, which of course is symbolic because it's being built in the centre of the capital of Qatar's former protector, Great Britain. But the Qatar Investment Fund, the Sovereign Wealth Fund, has made massive investments across the globe. Of course, the idea being that to involve other countries in the future of Qatar would also help it to survive and prosper and meet the threats from outside. The Qatar Foundation is also an attempt to spread Qatar's influence and power through this notion of soft power, particularly through education. And Qatar has also embarked on other projects such as sporting projects to bring international tournaments to Qatar. Mediation, Qatar has been made a name for itself as a mediator, initially in Lebanon and the Gaza Strip, but also more recently in Afghanistan. But all this culminated, certainly the progress of Qatar in the world and this wishing to project its profile, its brand, if you like, culminated in the award of the World Cup to Qatar in 2010. And as we all know, there was some controversy about that award, which has been investigated. But the simple fact is that the World Cup will go ahead next year. But the main issues that the World Cup has highlighted, because there's been this tremendous effort to build, I think it's 9 stadiums, new stadiums, and refurbish another 3, to embark on a huge construction program, which again sucks in more foreign workers, and put the world spotlight on the kafala system. The kafala system being a system of sponsorship, whereby workers come in from outside but can't leave unless they had a no objection certificate, or couldn't move from their employer to another unless they had the consent of their employer. All that's been abolished. And that said, there are still concerns about the kafala system, the conditions of foreign migrant workers, the way that their conditions are monitored, way that deaths are reported and investigated, and general transparency. So there are still problems there to do with the kafala system. So to deal briefly with the blockade, we now know that the blockade has been lifted, but for a time it looked quite serious situation for Qatar. The Arab Spring was really the start of it all, with Al Jazeera playing a prominent role across the Middle East and speaking against the interests of the ruling families in the Gulf, which obviously upset them. The Qatar's support of the Muslim Brotherhood, and it was the Muslim Brotherhood's support of a global Islamist state, which caused the Gulf monarchies the most concern. Well, clearly it was a threat to the existing order, and Qatar's support for the Brotherhood just seemed to defy explanation. The quartet, as they were called, was the formation of their neighbours, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, to impose a sea and air blockade, and also Egypt was involved in that blockade. As I say, the blockade has been lifted, although the tensions, the conflicts, the struggles of the past are not forgotten, and it's unlikely that the blockade will, the lifting of the blockade will resolve all those tensions. So just to conclude, we've seen the history of Qatar, how Qatar was born in quite difficult circumstances, and a lot of Qatar's early history is all about survival, seeking protection of a more powerful ally, the acquisition of wealth and the way that was divided within the family and caused conflicts with their neighbours as well as within the family, and also the issues of succession which ran through the ruling family really until Hamad took over and in 2013 handed over to his son Tamim. We've seen also the single resource economy, the way that brought in wealth, but also left Qatar with a vulnerability to the boom and bust cycle, and also the question of sovereignty, which was clearly a factor in the past, and some would say is still an issue, certainly with the Al Khalifa, who still claim to rule over the Qatar Peninsula. And it was only recently that their leaders were saying that the Qatar Peninsula is ours and its people. Now, whether that was just talk during the blockade, who knows? But it's quite clear that there's very strong feelings amongst the Khalifa in Bahrain that Qatar is still part of their emirate, if you like, part of their kingdom. And finally, the future. Looking to the future, we can see a Qatar emerging from the blockade. The underlying tension is not really resolved. It appears, as far as we know, Qatar made no concessions. And Qatar becoming more wealthy as time goes on, spreading its influence. But then, and the World Cup coming next year, providing the occasion for its former rivals to come together and enjoy some of the economic benefits of the World Cup. But the question arises, what of the future after that, when the big construction boom finishes? What's going to happen to the migrant workers? Will they all disappear, go home? If not, if the migrant workers remain, there's a very worrying statistic of 4 migrant workers to 1 Qatari citizen. Will they be integrated with Qatar society? That's unlikely. So what's the future hold for them? And finally, the whole issue of hydrocarbons. Clearly, the future of hydrocarbons is limited, and although that's going to take many decades for oil to fizzle out completely, and I doubt whether it will completely, but clearly that's a threat to Qatar's finances in the future. So many things in the future for Qatar to be aware of and deal with. And that completes my talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Quentin, for a really fascinating lecture. I hope that the people watching it have enjoyed it and has found it as interesting as I have. Before we go, I'm just going to share my screen so that anyone interested in IASA should go to our website, which is here. www.theiasa.com, and you'll find all about us, and you'll find on that details of future events. Thank you for watching.